That worked out beautifully. Hello, everybody. My name is Alex Zapisochny. I'm the co-founder and CEO of iCardiac Technologies. And as the slide indicates, in 2014, iCardiac was part of HTR Launchpad, an excellent program put together by Mike and Jim and others. But as Mike just indicated, the history of, for me and for the co-founders of iCardiac, with this program actually goes back a couple years further than that to about 2012. Now in 2012, the lean launchpad, the lean startup movement was somewhat new. And many of us who like to read up on these new things every day in TechCrunch, et cetera, like I do, were reading about it. And we thought we understood what this was about and why it's a good program. But when Mike called and said, are you interested in trying to be part of this advisory team to bring this to Rochester, we of course dug in much further into this process. And what we realized was that the reality was we only had scratched the surface of it through some of the reading we had done, and that there was really something very profound about a program like the Lean Startup methodology. And we, of course, very much wanted to see others in Rochester also learn about it. And part of what's very interesting and exciting, or certainly was for us, about the Lean Startup methodology is it was really a revelation in many ways when we read it. In my particular case, it reminded me of this quote from Emerson, because so often me and the other co-founders, we had experienced things in our entrepreneurial paths that seemed to be telling us something about the way startups worked, but we didn't really have a methodology to understand it. We thought we had just sort of been getting lucky. And coming across this methodology made us realize that, in fact, there was a lot to be learned about the way startups work that we can continue to apply no matter how experienced we may have been as entrepreneurs. And in this particular case, I want to give you a little bit of a sampling about what this program is about, partially because there are now a number of ways through HTR to learn about it, partially just to give you a sense as to what entrepreneurs in this community are learning. And so I want to tell you a little bit about the underpinnings for a few minutes of the lean startup approach and some of the stories for us in particular. Now, the seemingly simple, but in reality quite profound observation on which the Lean Startup program is built is that most startups do not fail because they set out a technology goal and don't meet it. Rather, they much more often fail because they have a technology vision, they fulfill it perfectly, and then it turns out that either nobody wants it, or they're not willing to pay for it, or there's something else wrong with the business model around trying to sell that technology out in the workplace or out in the marketplace. Seems simple, but in reality, most people don't build their business on this premise. And for me in particular, I had sort of witnessed this at work, but not really realizing that this was almost a law of entrepreneurship. When I originally got into the entrepreneurial world, I had come to work at a company called Linnell Systems, and I joined it as one of its earlier executives. And what I was struck by at that point was how lucky Linnell had been. And I don't mean they were lucky because they had started in a garage and sold for $440 million a number of years later. I thought they were lucky because they had spent the first 4 years of that company's existence not having anything to do with advanced security products, which is ultimately the only thing that they did and the thing that allowed them to be a success. Instead, they spent the first 4 years of their existence doing something called multimedia tools, and they even were able to sell some. And for me, it seemed like such a lucky break. Wow, how did they kind of pull it off that they had managed to do this very interesting course correction? Now, a number of years later, when I co-founded iCardiac, I thought that we too had lived through this atypical but lucky moment. Because when we got started, we took something called T-wave markers, which is a set of biomarkers that the University of Rochester had spent years working on. In fact, they collaborated with the FDA. And so it seemed like if anything was well vetted and useful in the marketplace, certainly these T-wave markers were going to be it. And we spent several years running around everywhere with all sorts of confidence that this was going to be quickly accepted. And in fact, it turned out that for a very different reason, it wasn't. Because the marketplace wasn't ready, we were a few years ahead, nobody wanted to get there quite yet. And luckily, eventually, we learned our lesson and licked our wounds and figured out something called high precision QT, and eventually things became more successful, and a couple of years ago we had a very nice exit ourselves. But if I were to be even more honest and detailed about what it is that happened at iCardiac that illustrates this story, the reality had been, yeah, we had a plan A with T-wave markers. It took several years to play that one out. There was a plan B. Pfizer spent 15 years and millions of dollars creating this plan B before it was licensed to us. And of course, we dutifully spent years running around thinking the marketplace wanted it because Pfizer wanted it. Why wouldn't everybody else want it? And again, it wasn't the plan. And there were other plan Bs, or plan Cs, and Ds, and Es, and Fs. And this is only a partially list because I wanted to make sure you could read all this. There were, in fact, I don't know, plan K, plan L, until we finally, one way or another, managed to what seemed like luck our way into plan Q, whatever it is, which was high precision QT. Lucky us. But in reality, if we had been familiar with the methodology of the lean startup, we would have known or would have more readily accepted the fact that going through plan A through all those letters was actually a very typical, in fact, the most typical path for success. And that in reality, the very essence of entrepreneurial wisdom is trying to figure out when do you keep going, when do you have that persistence that's so critical to being an entrepreneur versus how do you intelligently pivot and test other alternatives. A few other things, and again, this is not a full sampling at all. The book is very thick for the lean startup, so this is just a few quick lessons to see if some of your thoughts on it or to share a little bit about what we learned. Another key premise of the lean startup methodology is that a startup is in fact just a hypothesis. Most of the time, many people end up building out their companies under the premise that in fact a startup is just a small version of a big business, when in reality it's nothing of the sort. It's an experiment. It's something that's searching for a scalable, profitable business model. And on some levels it seems simple, but if you're going with the idea that your startup is just a small version of a big business, you plan very differently in terms of personnel, the way you go about actually trying to sell your product. Another key premise of the lean startup methodology is a healthy, very healthy skepticism of the business plan. Now, business plans, I don't want to, they're not all bad. In fact, for large businesses that have a proven concept, trying to say, hey, what is our 5-year plan to make sure that this comes into fruition is quite important. However, as a startup, as we just talked about, you don't have a proven concept, you have a hypothesis. And the one thing you can be sure of, not that business plans are all bad, but that the one way that your company will not unfold over a 5-year period is the way that you've written in your business plan. Here's another one of those interesting premises. Yes, that's not the most attractive baby. And there's a reason for that. And this in particular, by the way, applies to situations where the driving entrepreneurial force behind a startup is a scientist or a technologist. Because folks like that, while they are of course very welcome to be entrepreneurs, they oftentimes love the science. They may have spent years of their lives, millions of dollars of grant money, etc., finding a technology, and of course they love it. They gave birth to it, it's their baby. And it's extremely hard to hear how ugly that baby may be when that idea about what you've done comes into contact with market reality. So it's key to be highly detached, like the Buddhists or the Stoic philosophers may say, with regard to your technology, and be ready to throw it overboard if a better idea comes aboard. Another key premise behind, and I think this is a very interesting one as well and relates somewhat to the other one, is oftentimes we think of entrepreneurship as just something that a scientist or technologist does that happens to have some commercial value, when in reality these two disciplines are quite different. Now, certainly scientists can be great entrepreneurs. They can certainly be great teammates of entrepreneurs. But the person who, or people who are the driving entrepreneurial forces, in many ways actually need a different skill set, sometimes in some ways an opposite skill set. Those are the people that need to be able to be extremely creative. They need to be able to apply something called vujade. And for those who may remember what vujade is or may not remember what vujade is, it's the opposite of deja vu. So deja vu, you've seeing something for the first time and it feels familiar to you like you've seen it before. Vujade is the opposite. You may be seeing something you've seen 500 times, 1,000 times before, but suddenly you're struck with some insight about something novel and new that you'd never noticed about that before. And suddenly you have an idea for a problem that crystallizes in your head or a solution to that problem. This is another one, a key premise. In the kind of US startup mythology, and really mythology everywhere, companies are started in garages of people working crazy hours. And there's some work in garages or basements. That happens. But the reality is, for the driving entrepreneurial force, rarely is the answer to a particular question going to be in that building or in the garage. It's going to be in having sometimes uncomfortable conversations with people in the marketplace, potential customers, those who may be involved with your distribution chain. Another key premise that isn't always obvious to those who may look at Steve Jobs or whoever and think they just spend time in the garage. And of course, then the ultimate or kind of endpoint to all of it is that this is a process. Sometimes it takes 12 weeks, the process of trying to figure out what your business model is or ought to be. More often it takes months or years. In fact, most often it takes years, and it's a process where you're learning, you're iterating little by little, validating it, and sometimes pivoting. And hopefully you're able to do all of this with all sorts of enthusiasm as though you're doing it for the first time and before your money runs out or the patience of your venture capitalists run out. And so I mentioned at the beginning that in 2014, that's when iCardiac actually said, you know what, we've learned so much as co-founders, having been on the advisory board. We want to take 5 people who work for our company, give them a whole different name, they weren't called iCardiac, and we're going to put them in the program. Because we had this brainchild for about 2 years, this idea that we thought, you know, when we really have some time to get into it, that's going to be our next big business hit. And so these 5 people, smart people, great people, we gave them all this time off to do this. They went into the program to figure out how to commercialize this 2-year-old brainchild. And in 7 short weeks, it turned out that it was absolute nonsense. In fact, it was really embarrassing because in the 8th week, they came to me and said, what are we going to tell Mike Riedlinger? I don't even, like, we're supposed to give weekly updates and we don't want to look like idiots. They actually asked me to come and say, hey, we were idiots, and I'm pretty sure I did. But even though this seems like not a great outcome, in fact, it is a great outcome because we didn't have to spend any more time or energy, and we learned a lot. We learned a lot, we iterated, and we have since created other things that do have great commercial value for us. And on top of that, and this is one of the key things that programs like HTR Launchpad do for our community, it's not just about the particular idea that happened, and whether it works or not, that happens to be important. It's getting people into a program where they can actually practice entrepreneurial skills. Those 5 people who partook in that program came back with totally different attitudes about what it's like to really have ideas and validate them. And this has been extremely valuable for us, and it's spread throughout our organization to others. And of course, the final lesson for us, and hopefully for others, is that the words lean startup is somewhat of a misnomer, because it's not really just for startups. It's for any organization that wants to do something and wants to find a methodology by which they can effectively and efficiently figure out whether what they're dreaming up really has some basis in market reality or not. And so I thank everybody very much for coming, but I especially want to thank first the folks who made the HTR Lean Launchpad program what it is and allowed us to gain all sorts of insight and many others to gain insight. Because I think that what programs like this do for all of us is, first of all, they create something that's of value no matter how experienced you are. It's also key for any city that wants to have a vibrant entrepreneurial hub to be able to have places where innovative models like Lean Launchpad can be taught and spread locally. And of course, in order for our ecosystem to keep evolving, and I think it's made amazing strides over the last five plus years, it's important to have places where these so-called creative collisions can happen. We got to know so many people through our experience through HTR Launchpad, many people we worked with afterward in some consulting role or just bouncing ideas off of each other. And of course, it's critical to have examples of success. And so I want to Again, thanks specifically some people, Mike Riedlinger, Jim Sinal, who are really the two driving forces behind HTR Launchpad program that's been so excellent, the Farish Foundation that gave money for that program to get started, and of course all the board and staff that made it possible. And lastly, thank all of you for coming, because I think it's events like this where those creative collisions can continue to collide and we can actually do something positive for our ecosystem. Thank you very much.